It's late. The kind of late where the silence isn't just quiet, it buzzes. Your room feels still, maybe too still. The kind of stillness that makes you question if the air got heavier, or if it's just your thoughts gaining weight. You're lying there, wide awake, brain doing laps, wondering if you locked the door, or if sleep is just playing hard to get again. Like an ex who won't text back but still watches your stories. And if you're here, listening while the world sleeps, I'm glad you showed up. If this helps take the edge off your thoughts, even a little, that's enough. No pressure, no subscription spell required. Now, since you're already awake, let me take you somewhere colder, older, stranger, not to your childhood, to something darker, a different kind of nightmare, one stitched together with wool cloaks and firewood. A place where smiles hid suspicion and candlelight didn't just chase shadows, it exposed them. Salem, Massachusetts. Winter, 1692. The kind of cold that freezes lies mid-sentence, and there were plenty floating in the air. But it wasn't just frost that crept through the town. It was fear. Not the kind that jumps out at you. The quieter kind. The kind that seeps through wooden walls, rattles the floorboards, and settles in the corners of prayer rooms. You wouldn't hear screams or sobs. Just the slow, steady tick of judgment. This was a town where your value wasn't your kindness or honesty or whether you washed regularly. It was how invisible you could be. The less you stood out, the holier you seemed. Be quiet. Be devout. Be the moral equivalent of soggy cabbage. That was the goal. And yet, even in that bland little snow globe of obedience, something stirred. It started with the oldest ingredient in any disaster: boredom. A group of girls with too much time, not enough warmth, and a captive audience. A woman from Barbados, enslaved, telling ghost stories by firelight. A few spasms. A handful of convenient convulsions. And suddenly, the village found its favorite mask. They called it witchcraft, because saying what it really was, trauma, repression, maybe some undiagnosed epilepsy, felt a bit too modern for people who thought smiling was a gateway to sin. Salem didn't stumble upon witches. It invented them. In a society built on obedience and spiritual austerity, witches became the ultimate scapegoats, a convenient bucket for everything the town didn't want to understand. Woman with opinions? Threat. Knew how to heal with herbs? Suspicious. Unmarried and confident? Practically halfway to hell. Now imagine that world. Cold, rigid, always watching. The smell of tallow candles. The scratch of benches built for suffering. Eye contact? Risky. Everything you were had to be tucked in and toned down. Even the trees whispered more than the townspeople. Branches creaked like they carried secrets. Shadows stretched long, pulled not by the moon, but by sermons and shame. Yet, at dawn, you wouldn't guess any of that. The village looked peaceful, quaint, the kind of place you'd call charming if you passed through sipping a pumpkin spice latte. But beneath those snowy rooftops, judgment brewed in silence. Every cough, every pause at the market, every glance held half a second too long. It all counted. And when the tally was full, justice didn't knock. It barged in with scripture and rope. And here's the uncomfortable part. These weren't villains. They were neighbors. People who baked bread in the morning and condemned each other by candlelight. What's worse, they believed they were doing good, cleansing evil, saving souls. Few things are more dangerous than cruelty committed with conviction. So what haunts us about Salem? The executions? The false confessions? Or the fact that it doesn't feel so far away? Paranoia never died. It just changed outfits. Today we swap gallows for Wi-Fi. Hang reputations instead of bodies. The pitchforks? Mostly digital now. But don't worry. Here, you're safe. You're just listening. No one's watching. No one's judging. Which is ironic, considering how close we're getting to the fire. This isn't just a story. It's a blueprint. Fear, silence, control. The recipe never really changed. It always begins with something small. A twitch. A whisper. You'd think a place drowning in religion would be peaceful. But Salem wasn't peaceful. It was tense. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe you. It corners you. Makes your ears ring. A quiet that presses in until something snaps. The town looked like it was built by people allergic to comfort. Everything was wood. Rough, cold, and loud underfoot. Houses were small. Rooms smaller. Privacy didn't exist. You didn't just share space, you shared breath. Winters didn't just freeze your fingers. They froze your identity. Imagine sleeping beside a goat, 7 family members, and a wall that moaned every time the wind changed. A sneeze could trigger a prayer circle. A nightmare? Grounds for suspicion. Dreams weren't personal. They were political. Too vivid? You were hiding something. Too peaceful? Clearly suspicious. Joy was alarming. Grief was godly. Laughter? A theological offense. Self-expression wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. Dancing was scandal with rhythm. Singing had to be miserable to be holy. And the rules? Not written, but etched into glances. Into the stiff shoulders. Into how tightly you folded your hands at the dinner table. Everyone was a detective. Watching. Interpreting. Hoping to catch sin like it was contagious. And praying judgment might be the cure. Now picture Salem through a child's eyes. The wind cracks through bare trees like a whip. You smell wood smoke from the one stove still burning. And your neighbors? Heads down, faces frozen in an expression somewhere between prayer and constipation. Every house had a Bible and a cold spot. Every barn carried a draft and a secret. And the whole town? It wasn't built. It was braced. As if the architecture itself knew something was coming. Peace didn't feel like peace. It felt like a pause. You didn't ask questions in Salem. You swallowed them. Whispered them into your pillow and prayed they wouldn't echo loud enough for heaven to hear. Because curiosity looked a lot like rebellion. And rebellion had another name. Possession. Even sleep wasn't safe. Sleep too long? Sloth. Too little? Paranoia. Dream at all? Suspicious. Sleep soundly? Definitely hiding something. In Salem, the only safe form of rest was death. And yet, people survived. They built families, baked bread, spun wool with hands so cracked they looked stitched from bark. Not out of hope, but because doing what you always did was easier than falling apart. But beneath that rhythm, beneath the folded hands and frozen smiles, there was pressure. A low hum, the kind that settles under sermons and grows under silence. And pressure, left long enough, doesn't leak. It breaks. That's the Salem we're walking into. A village dressed in scripture but wired with tension. Where everyone was exhausted. Not just from winter, but from pretending. From living a life where sin was measured in glances and salvation required vanishing. So when someone finally whispered, "She's a witch," truth didn't matter. The crack had opened. And fear? It never walks in. It kicks the door off its hinges. That was the secret. It was never really about witches. It was about release. A town holding its breath for too long, finally exhaling, even if it meant setting someone else on fire. And no, this isn't ancient history. It's a pattern. One that still repeats anywhere silence is sold as virtue, and fear hides behind righteousness. It didn't start with fire or thunder. It started small, as these things always do. A cough, a twitch, a few girls, a little too dramatic, a little too cold. claiming to feel something dark, something unnamed, something not their fault, obviously. Picture it. A wooden meeting house colder than forgiveness. A few teenage girls on the floor, shaking, groaning, clawing at invisible demons. No screens, no distractions, just raw panic and the kind of spiritual theater that sells out fast. Tickets? Free. Reason? Optional. The adults watched, concerned, then confused, then afraid. Because when a child twitches in 1692, there are only two explanations: sugar or Satan. And since sugar was rare and medicine was still prey and hope, the answer was obvious. Possession, affliction, evil elbows, demons in their pockets. A typical Tuesday. The two stars of this opening act? Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, a reverend's daughter and his niece. Which in Salem meant they were beyond reproach. Because if you can't trust bored preteens with religious trauma, who can you trust? Soon, the symptoms spread. Barking, screaming, speaking in tongues, seeing shadows. The town didn't just watch, it leaned in. After all, this was the most excitement they'd had since the last frost. The girls weren't just afflicted. They were the center of attention. Local celebrities, in the worst possible way. Then came the inevitable question. Who did this to you? Bad idea. You don't ask that in a town full of grudges and zero entertainment. The girls pointed, not at the powerful, of course, but at the strange, the inconvenient, the disposable. First, Tituba. Enslaved. Foreign, black. She told stories, knew herbs, and had the nerve to exist outside the mold. That alone made her a walking target. Next, Sarah Good. Poor, homeless, miserable. She mumbled to herself and looked like she hadn't smiled since 1674. Then Sarah Osborne. Old, sick, and worst of all, she missed church. Frequently. It was the casting call from hell. The town didn't want facts. It wanted characters. And these women fit the narrative perfectly. Outsiders, misfits, human question marks. Under pressure, Tituba broke. And when cornered by men with too much scripture and no chill, she did what many would, she confessed. Not just to witchcraft, but to flying, talking to the devil, and signing some oversized red book of darkness. Sure, why not? But she didn't stop there. She gave them names. Said there were more. Dozens. Witches among them, hiding in plain sight. The story grew teeth. The town lost its mind. More girls came forward. More accusations followed. Each name spoken fed a dozen more in whispers. Gossip metastasized. The town's immune system turned on itself, attacking anything unfamiliar, inconvenient, or just unlucky. Once your name was spoken, it stuck. Like soot, like shame, like a stain no fabric of your life that no apology could scrub out. Guilt didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. The moment your name was uttered, you were already standing in line for the gallows. The hysteria spread like wildfire, only colder. Fueled by sermons, snow, and certainty. Men who could barely write signed arrest warrants without hesitation. And the people? They didn't blink. They nodded. They prayed. They built more rope. And some, disturbingly, felt relief. Because at last, all the tension had somewhere to go. Failed crops, sick cows, bad dreams, no longer their fault. Now there was someone to blame. Preferably a woman. Preferably strange. Salem didn't collapse because of wickedness. It collapsed because fear found a microphone and handed it to teenage girls with performance skills, preachers with pride, and neighbors who never liked your cooking anyway. The first accusation wasn't a spark. It was a fuse. Once lit, the whispers turned to shouts. And the town, once frozen in quiet suspicion, ignited in righteous noise. Roles were assigned, villains chosen, victims sacrificed, and the audience, delighted, wide-eyed, starved for spectacle. Justice, it seemed, was whatever looked best in candlelight. Fairness never had a seat in Salem. In fact, it was probably burned at the stake early on. Trials weren't really trials. They were theater. Bad theater. The kind where dreams, vague vibes, and ghost stories passed for evidence. Logic was considered heresy. Take spectral evidence, for example. If someone said, "Her spirit strangled me," in a dream, that counted. Apparently, nightmares were legally binding. The judges, mostly men of the cloth, rigid, humorless, and allergic to uncertainty. One of them, Samuel Sewell, apologized, years later, of course, after the bodies had been buried and the wind had moved on. The accused had two choices: confess and live, for now, or deny and die. A spiritual trap. Admit guilt to prove innocence. Gaslighting with scripture. Confessing meant naming others. Feeding the machine. It was a theological pyramid scheme. Instead of earning points, you just delayed your execution. Until you didn't. And through it all, people watched. Like it was entertainment. They brought lunch. They brought their kids. Because nothing says family values like a public hanging based on teen hysteria. The gallows didn't spring up overnight. They were built slowly, with help. A community project, like a bake sale, but with rope and judgment. And once they stood, the real preaching began, not in churches, but in open sky. Bodies swinging like punctuation marks to sermons no one wanted to write down. Rebecca Nurse was one of them. Respected, elderly, gentle. She was hanged because she didn't tremble on cue. Her composure offended them. Calm, in Salem, was suspicious. Peace looked too much like defiance. Then there was Giles Corey. He refused to speak, didn't plead, didn't bend. So they crushed him, literally. Stones on his chest until he couldn't breathe. His final words? More weight. Powerful. Haunting. And still, he died. The system didn't break. It kept moving, swallowing more names. More people who were too outspoken, too odd, too alone, too female. These weren't witches. They were humans. Mothers. Healers. Question marks. Their crime wasn't sorcery. It was complexity. Independence. Knowing too much. Needing too little. The trials weren't about protecting the town. They were about controlling it. The church didn't fear curses. It feared free will. Justice in Salem wore holy robes, but moved like a mob. And mobs don't pause. They don't consider. They react. Loudly. With torches. Maybe the worst part wasn't the rope, but the silence that allowed it. The people who watched it all happen. Who lowered their eyes. Folded their hands. Told themselves it wasn't their place. Silence pretends to be safe. Until it isn't. That's what made the noose terrifying. Not just the violence, but the quiet consent behind it. The whispers that sounded like, well, she was always different. And if you think we've moved past that, I admire your optimism. But we've just changed the tools. Today, the flames are digital. The mobs come in threads. The trials happen in comments, and the verdict hits before the facts arrive. The language is different. The ritual is the same. And while that may be something to unpack later, for now, you're here, in a village frozen in time, where scripture drowned truth, and fear dressed itself as virtue. The gallows are ready. The crowd is gathering. And somewhere, someone's already whispering the next name. Just hope it's not yours. They didn't fly on brooms. No cackling over cauldrons. No baby stealing, demon summoning, or shape-shifting at midnight. Though, honestly, turning into a cat might have. Take Sarah Good. Poor, sharp-tongued, unimpressed with social niceties. She begged. She muttered. She didn't play the part. In Salem, that was enough. She wasn't a witch. She was a problem. Unwashed rebellion in a bonnet. Rebecca Nurse? She was kind, respected, elderly, and still accused. Her crime? Questioning power without panic. Staying calm when everyone else was frothing. She didn't fit the narrative, and that made her dangerous. Saints you can't control are scarier than sinners you can punish. And then there was Tituba. Enslaved. Foreign. The walking embodiment of other. Her accent, her skin, her stories, all wrong. So they rewrote her into something they could control. A villain. She became the town's mirror, and they cracked it with fear. These weren't spellcasters caught in the act. They were women written into a role that always ended the same. In Salem, witch wasn't a person. It was a placeholder, for grief, for resistance, for everything the town didn't want to face in itself. They were erased without flames. Forgotten not with fire, but with silence. Their stories weren't told, they were buried. Not out of malice, but out of convenience. Some were widows. Some owned land. Some used herbs to heal, the same herbs modern doctors would later turn into pharmaceuticals. But in 1692, if you knew how to soothe a fever or stop a cough, you were either divine or doomed. They had voices, opinions, losses they carried like armor. They didn't shrink. They didn't disappear. And in a culture obsessed with purity and obedience, that made them dangerous. So they were cut out, cropped from memory like a bad photo. Not because they were evil, but because they were reminders that life is messy, loud, defiant. And that didn't fit the program. You don't know their names. You were never meant to. You were supposed to remember the flames, not the women caught in them. But the truth is, they were never witches. They were labeled that way. And that label says more about who gave it than who wore it. They weren't casting spells. They were breaking scripts. Living proof that a woman could think, speak, and survive without permission. And yet, they didn't. Not in the way we wish they had. Their bodies were silenced. Their legacies stained. The rope didn't just end lives. It anchored shame into generations. But it didn't win. Because you're here, listening, remembering, not ghosts, people, not monsters, women. And with that simple act, you begin to unravel a lie that was always too tidy. Let's be honest, this wasn't a witch hunt. It was a purge of women who didn't bend fast enough. And maybe that's the real magic they carried. Not in potions or charms, but in the radical act of simply existing without apology. Fear was meant to keep you alive. Avoid cliffs. Fend off tigers. Steer clear of sketchy mushrooms. Basic survival instincts. But when left unsupervised, fear mutates. And in Salem, it didn't just grow. It spread like mold in the walls. Quiet at first, then everywhere. This wasn't witchcraft. It was combustion. A cold little village with no therapy, no vent, and too much religion, exploding in slow motion. The technical term is hysteria. But let's not be fooled by the Latin. It was panic in a nice dress. A collective meltdown disguised as spiritual clarity. And it caught fast. Faster than gossip. More contagious than laughter. Fear doesn't need proof. It only needs belief. The girls were the match. But the fuel? That was everyone else. The adults. The elders. The supposed voices of reason who should have put a stop to it, but didn't. Or worse, knew better and stayed quiet. Because silence was easier than doubt, safer than truth. No one thought they were the villain. No one wakes up and says, "Today, I'll destroy my neighbor's life using the emotional logic of a raccoon on Red Bull." But fear doesn't need a villain. It just needs a story that sticks. The story Salem told itself was simple. Evil is real, invisible, nearby, and if we don't act now, it'll spoil the milk, curse the children, and give us unsettling dreams. Classic fear marketing. Just enough truth to make it plausible. Just enough nonsense to let it spiral. Fear does strange things to the brain. It silences logic. It romances delusion. It whispers that feelings are facts. And once that settles in, disagreement becomes dangerous. Sound familiar? Welcome to the Puritan algorithm. No Wi-Fi required. These kinds of mass breakdowns don't happen in open, relaxed communities. They need tension, tight spaces, long winters, too much religion, bad bread, no therapy. Then boom, accusations, panic, chaos. Some historians think it might have been ergot, a hallucinogenic mold in rye. Others point to trauma from war or abuse. Or maybe it was just boredom. And once the girls got attention, there was no off-ramp. The only way out was escalation. Suddenly, everything became a symptom. I felt a chill. I saw a shadow. My goat blinked weird. No evidence required, just fear with good storytelling. And fear, once it has a scapegoat, doesn't let go. Especially when the scapegoat can't fight back. Because here's the nightmare. The crowd thought it was righteous. That they were saving the town. Doubt became sin. Calm became suspect. This wasn't just hysteria. It was moral panic with an audience. The longer it lasted, the harder it was to stop. No one wants to admit they've hanged the wrong people. You can't just shrug and say, "Turns out Martha wasn't summoning demons, she was making broth." So they kept going. More accusations, more trials, more hangings. Because once fear becomes official policy, it rarely steps aside on its own. And if you're tempted to think we've evolved, think again. That's the real legacy of Salem. Not just its tragedy, but how efficient the machinery was. How fear looked like morality. How doubt was punished and silence rewarded. You've probably felt it too. That moment when speaking up feels riskier than staying quiet. When truth feels like exposure. When standing out feels like a setup. Because that's how these things start. Not with fire, but with whispers. And speaking of whispers, even dreaming was dangerous. Sleep, in Salem, wasn't sacred. It was suspicious. Too tired? Weak? Too rested? Hiding something? Smile in the morning? Satan probably tucked you in. Dreams were worse. Because dreams are private. Untamed. Out of reach from preachers and judges. In a society built on surveillance, an unsupervised imagination was a threat. Sleep wasn't rest, it was vulnerability. And if your mind wandered too far, you might wake up branded. So people didn't sleep. Not well, anyway. They stayed alert. Hypervigilant. Because insomnia wasn't a disorder, it was armor. And that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Maybe sleep isn't passive. Maybe it's the one moment you belong entirely to yourself. No audience. No performance. No filters or edits. Just you, unoptimized, unobserved, untouched. In a culture obsessed with visibility and control, that's practically an act of rebellion. So if you drift off tonight, deeply, fully, without apology, congrats. You've just committed the most subversive act in Salem. Rest. You've trusted your body. You've slipped out of reach. You've reclaimed peace, the quiet kind, the real kind. And maybe, just maybe, as you dream, those forgotten women finally get to rest too. Not as ghosts, but as memories, breathing again through your stillness. We like to believe we've moved on, that we're past the pitchforks and public trials. But Salem never disappeared. It just adapted. Now we do it with hashtags, headlines, algorithms, one viral moment at a time. No gallows required, just a screen and a sense of moral urgency. And the math hasn't changed. Fear plus outrage plus performance equals digital execution. Only now we call it accountability and pretend it's cleaner. One accusation, one viral clip, one misunderstood sentence. And someone's erased, not because they're guilty, but because it feels true. Sound familiar? The fear's still here, just better dressed. We don't hunt witches anymore. We hunt the inconvenient, the unfiltered, the too much, and we do it fast. Now, the insomnia doesn't come from frost or curses. It comes from the feed, from the pressure to perform, from knowing that one wrong breath online can become your new identity. We've built a new Salem, one that fits in our pockets, and we walk through it daily, adjusting our tone, curating our thoughts, treating every conversation like a tightrope. Because we're not afraid of demons anymore. We're afraid of being misread. We still hold purity contests. We still demand allegiance. We still exile those who hesitate or question the script. And every so often, someone steps out of line, posts too little, says too much, or simply pauses. And that's all it takes. But here's the thing. Once you see the pattern, you can break it. You can start noticing who gets silenced and why, who benefits from the bonfires, who's being shaped by fear instead of truth. And suddenly Salem becomes something else. Not just history, a reflection, a reminder. You're not in 1692, but if you've ever bitten your tongue instead of speaking, you've felt the echo. If you've ever chosen silence over honesty, you've stepped onto that same stage. So maybe the spell we need now isn't protection, it's permission. To rest, to question, to be, without apology or armor. Because every time you sleep, really sleep, the old fear loses power. Not because it disappears, but because it gets seen for what it is. A cage that can be walked out of. Let's imagine something different. Let's say the women of Salem weren't evil, weren't broken, just free. And that terrified everyone. Because freedom, real freedom, doesn't follow rules. It doesn't sit politely. It doesn't shrink. It laughs too loud. It wears what it wants. It knows when to speak and when to rest. And if that sounds familiar, congratulations. You might be a witch. Not the broom kind. Not the costume kind. The kind that knows when to stop. That sleeps when tired. That listens to instinct. That says no without a monologue. Because Salem didn't fear spells. It feared boundaries. It feared women who didn't beg. People who didn't conform. Minds that couldn't be owned. That's how the myth began. Not as a warning about witches, but as a warning to be less. To not stand out. To stay inside the lines. So maybe it's time to take it back. Maybe the witch isn't a threat. Maybe she's the reminder. The part of you that still knows how to breathe. How to stop explaining. How to take up space without apology. That gentle voice telling you to log off. Lower your shoulders. Close your eyes. That's her. That's your magic. And here's the twist. You don't need crystals, chants, or fancy apps. You just need permission. To pause. To be human. To know that exhaustion isn't weakness. That silence isn't absence. That peace isn't selfish. It's sacred. Stillness, not the anxious kind, but the sacred kind. The kind that hums when your phone is finally off. That stretches down your spine as you exhale, not to prove anything, just because you can. And maybe your altar isn't made of stone. Maybe it's your bed, your breath, your boundaries. That quiet choice to not check one more thing before you sleep. The world doesn't quite know what to do with people who aren't always available. And that's the magic. The quiet rebellion. To say, tonight, I'm not for consumption. I'm for me. So when they whisper that witches are rising again, smile. Because they never really left. They just got better at hiding. In yoga classes, grocery store lines, and in you, sipping tea at 2 a.m., wondering why your soul feels louder in the dark. And as you finally begin to drift, gently, deeply, remember this. Dreaming is resistance. Softness is strength. And you, wrapped in your own warmth, eyes closed, mind unguarded, you're casting the oldest spell of all. Rest. So now, here you are. After the trials. After the whispers and the gallows. After generations of fear disguised as virtue and silence sold as safety. After 10 chapters of ghosts and fire and sleepless laughter in the dark, here you are. Still breathing. Still awake. And maybe, for once, still. There's something sacred in that. Not because it's holy, but because it's real. You, in a quiet room, with no audience, no script, no judgment. Just the gentle sound of your own existence. Let that be enough. And silence, true silence, it's not empty. It's full of you. The moment when the noise fades and you're not fixing, proving, or pretending. You're just here, tired, whole. Picture this, a room untouched by drama. A mind no longer chasing shadows. A body that no longer needs to posture or prove anything to anyone. Just breath. Then another. Then the hush of sleep approaching like an old friend. Unhurried, unquestioning. The stories are over. The fire is low. The witches? They're gone. Or maybe they're finally home. Making tea. Laughing softly at how much we misunderstood them. Either way, the danger has passed. And you've earned this quiet. You've survived a different kind of darkness. The modern kind. The one that shouts in headlines and hides in calendars. And tonight, just tonight, you get to choose something softer. You don't need a spell, or a sermon, or a checklist for tomorrow. You just need this. This stillness. This bed. This breath. So close your eyes. Let it all drop. The roles, the tension, the armor you didn't even know you were wearing. You can pick it back up in the morning, if you must. But for now, let it rest. Because unlike Salem, you get to choose silence. And that might be the most powerful thing of all. Let's leave the noise behind. Let's walk, slowly, into something older, quieter. A road not built by fire, but by footsteps. But wait, before you disappear completely into sleep, something stirs. Not a scream, not a gallows, not fear, but the softest rustle of movement. Cloth brushing sand, a camel's bell, a wind that smells of cinnamon and firelight. Another world is waking, older than Salem, wider than any church wall. Because long before we figured out how to fear each other professionally, we figured out how to swap shiny things. Silk for glass, spices for ink, lies for legends. You know, the basics. So hang around a little longer. Let the fire fade. Leave your brain slightly ajar. We're ditching the gallows and stepping onto a path stitched not with rope, but with luxury fabric no one actually needed. The desert's yawning. The stars are mildly intrigued. And the next story? It's already strutting in like it owns the place. Picture it. 2 empires so far apart they couldn't even agree on what civilized meant. Rome, Marble, egos, lions, drama queens in togas. And China, dragons, poetry, silk, dynasties with names that sound like incense ingredients. No Wi-Fi, no GPS, no Google Translate, just vibes. And yet, somehow, they met. Not through fleets, not through friendly diplomatic brunches, but through fabric, delicate, glowing, unreasonably expensive. Silk. Rome had no idea where it came from, only that it shimmered like guilt and felt like something your priest wouldn't approve of. Senators flaunted it. Generals died for it. Emperors taxed it. Husbands blamed it for literally everything. And did anyone stop buying it? Of course not. Meanwhile, China played it cool. Like, oh this? Just something we spin out of worms. Nothing major. They called it Psy and guarded the secret like it was the ancient version of a Netflix password. So how did the trade actually start? Not with treaties or fireworks or press conferences. Just footsteps. A few dusty merchants. Some tired camels. One bell jingling somewhere it shouldn't. Between Rome and China, two worlds separated by mountains, deserts, and at least 12 language barriers, a path emerged. Not because anyone planned it. Just because greed and curiosity are better cartographers than any empire. It wasn't one road. It was 100 bad decisions that somehow connected. A chaotic web of dirt, snow, mirages, and bold travel insurance claims. Some stretches were chill. Others, full-on fever dream. Think blizzards, heat stroke, bandits, and the occasional existential crisis halfway through a sandstorm. But still, they walked. Why? Because gold. Because jade. Because stories. Because humans are apparently willing to risk death for better interior design and weird spices. But let's be honest, it was never really about the silk. Silk was just the excuse. The sparkly bait dangled in front of tired people with empty pockets and too much ambition. What they really wanted? Connection. Because every time a Roman bumped into a Sogdian, who chatted with a Persian, who bartered with a Kushan, who nodded at a Chinese envoy, something incredible happened. No war, no speeches, just curiosity, and maybe some light gossip. They swapped stories, sampled suspicious food, tried on each other's gods, lied a little, laughed a lot, and somehow, over 7,000 kilometers of what are we even doing, humanity managed not to self-destruct. And the wildest part? No one posted about it. No selfies. No hashtags. Just actual human contact. Wild concept. I know. See, the Silk Road wasn't a road. It was a conversation. A long, confusing, dust-covered way of saying, "Hi, we exist too." And against all odds, the message landed. Not perfectly, not politely, but enough. Enough for porcelain to show up in Roman ruins. Enough for Buddhas to chill in Afghan caves. Enough for paper to wander west and blow a few empires' minds. The Romans and the Chinese never met, but their shadows did. Somewhere, in some tavern, some inn, under a sky full of judgmental stars, two distant worlds whispered to each other across the sand. And somehow, miraculously, it stuck. Not everything made it through. Not in one piece. Not politely. But just enough. Enough for shards of Chinese porcelain to crash a Roman dinner party. Enough for Buddhist statues to show up in caves they clearly didn't book. Enough for paper to wander west, quietly plotting to overthrow the oral tradition. The Roman and the Chinese never shook hands. But their shadows? Oh, they met. Somewhere between desert tea houses and freezing mountain inns, over bowls of mystery stew and questionable wine, the two worlds brushed fingertips and didn't immediately declare war. Miraculous? Really. So next time someone sighs dramatically and says, "The world is too broken to fix," maybe remind them. Two ancient empires, who couldn't agree on the shape of the sky or how to pronounce the word God, still managed to pass silk from hand to hand, across continents, through blizzards and bandits, without ever making eye contact. And that might be history's most passive-aggressive miracle. Because silk? That was just the decoy, the shimmer to catch your attention. What really traveled down that road couldn't be weighed or taxed or sold by the meter. It was ideas and smells, and occasionally, very inconvenient explosions. Let's start with scent, because nothing disrespects borders quite like perfume. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Somalia, sandalwood from India, musk from Tibet. Each smell wasn't just pleasant, it was a statement, a theology, a mood board for gods. One drop of oil could bless a king, charm a lover, cleanse a soul, or just cover up the fact that you hadn't bathed since Babylon fell. Merchants weren't just selling products. They were selling atmospheres, emotional support potions. Picture this. Someone opens a cloth bundle in a noisy bazaar and suddenly it smells like a forest from a dream you didn't know you missed. Instant myth. No marketing team needed. And then came the whispers. From China, Confucianism arrived. Balance, respect, duty, and a subtle reminder that maybe you should call your parents more often. From India, Buddhism floated in, with detachment, suffering, peace, and the seductive promise of a nap that lasts forever. From Persia, Zoroastrian fire, all about light versus darkness, good versus evil, and flames that never die, because apparently subtlety is overrated. And from the West, the God of Abraham, packing wrath, commandments, and absolutely zero tolerance for nuance. These belief systems didn't just coexist. They bumped into each other in the dark, borrowed each other's metaphors, swapped accessories, and occasionally forgot who invented what. A bodhisattva with Greek curls. A Buddhist sutra written in Sogdian. A cross stashed inside a Mongol stulbag like a spiritual snack. Faith became multilingual and mildly confused. And let's not forget the other travelers. Ideas. Mathematics. Astronomy. Philosophy. All bouncing around the desert like intellectual tumbleweeds. One day, you're in a dusty outpost learning how to map constellations. The next, someone teaches you how to make better beer. Academic exchange, Silk Road edition. It was chaotic. It was unregulated. It was glorious. And then, boom. Literally, gunpowder. China invented it quietly, probably while trying to cure hiccups. At first, it made fireworks. Then someone thought, what if we made this deadly? And the rest is a montage of flaming arrows, surprised kings, and a lot of smoke. Gunpowder didn't arrive with fanfare. It traveled like gossip, messy, fast, and slightly misquoted. Thanks to a monk, a mule, and someone who wasn't great at labeling dangerous cargo, the West met its new favorite weapon. Because here's the thing about the Silk Road. It didn't care about visas, or borders, or whether your religion was trending. If you had something worth carrying, a thought, a smell, a story, the road made space. Cultures didn't just politely coexist. They bled into each other like watercolors in a storm. A stew in Syria tasted faintly of Szechuan pepper. A bedtime story in Uzbekistan featured a dragon with suspiciously Chinese vibes. A desert ritual echoed chants from a jungle temple half a planet away. This wasn't globalization. It was creative chaos. Messy, risky, beautiful. Not always fair. Not always peaceful. But real. And yes, sometimes things got mangled in translation. Or turned into weapons. Or misinterpreted so badly they needed a rebrand. But many survived. Many adapted. Many changed the world. So the next time you strike a match, say a prayer, drink your overpriced tea, move a knight on a chessboard, or hear a bell ring in the distance, just remember, that moment, it was hand-delivered, by someone, on foot, carrying a piece of the world they never got to see, for you to have, here, now. And yet, somehow, they still reached you. Sure, the scrolls were filled with talk of glory and silk and destiny. The emperors dreamed of diplomacy, and gold, mostly gold. But the road itself? Oh, it was less divine plan and more. Sand in your socks, lips like parchment, and an endless horizon that gaslit you for 3 months straight. You want romance? Try hiking through a desert that thinks your water bottle is a joke. Try peeling your tongue off the roof of your mouth with each breath. Try walking for so long you forget if that distant blur is a city or a mirage playing hard to get. The caravans didn't glide. They didn't journey. They crawled. Like ants with trust issues, dragging the hopes of empires across terrain that had zero interest in their economic goals. Now picture this: weeks, months, of walking. The sky? A personal grudge. The sun? Less celestial light, more blunt force trauma. No trees. No streams. Just heat that whispers, "Why are you even here?" Welcome to the real Silk Road. Not a dreamy corridor of trade and culture. A test. A gauntlet. A multi-day hike with surprise sandstorms and unsolicited camel commentary. And yet, they kept coming. From China. From India. Persia. Rome. Not because it was reasonable, but because something, a rumor, a dream, a better deal, kept calling from the other side. Maybe it was gold. Maybe it was myth. Maybe it was just chronic wanderlust before Instagram ruined it. The caravans were long, chaotic, a traveling circus of traders, cooks, translators, and thieves, which, by the way, were often the same people. Because where there's treasure, there's someone holding a map upside down and swearing they know a shortcut. At night, the sun finally gave up its daily attempt to kill everyone, and the desert cooled. Not comfortable cooled, more like you'll still hate it, but less. Tents popped up like temporary ghosts. Fires crackled. Stories were traded in 20 dialects and at least 4 active currencies. Someone boiled tea. Someone else played a sad instrument they swore was just out of tune. Someone counted coins. And someone stared up at the stars like they owed him answers. But no one truly slept. The desert doesn't allow luxury. There were bandits. There were snakes. There were camels who wandered off midnight, taking your savings and your spare socks with them. And still, they came back. Again. And again. Because that's the cost of connection. You want a link between East and West? It wasn't forged in palaces. It was limped into place, one blister at a time. The road didn't belong to kings. It belonged to the sunburned, the sleep-deprived, the people who thought maybe, just maybe, the next town had cold drinks and fewer existential crises. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it ghosted them. Sometimes it literally vanished into thin air. But the Silk Road wasn't about certainty. It was about motion. About carrying not just goods, but belief. The belief that beyond this cursed dune, beyond the next terrible cup of overboiled tea, there might be something better. That's hope, sand-baked, sweat-soaked, and wildly underpaid. And then, night would fall, like a sigh. The heat would retreat like a drama queen leaving the stage. The wind would stop screaming. And the silence? It would finally shut up. The stars didn't twinkle. They stared, like they'd been waiting all day for you to stop whining. That sky wasn't just big. It was personal. A galaxy of you tried stickers for every blister you earned. And in that moment, when the world finally stopped yelling, the bells began. Not loud, not dramatic, just soft little clinks, hanging from camel necks, swaying like sleepy lullabies for the earth itself. Not music, not noise, just presence. The kind of sound that doesn't demand attention, but settles in your bones like a memory you didn't know you missed. The caravans moved slower at night. Cooler air, fewer thieves, less airborne sand attempting to colonize your lungs. And those bells, those bronze murmurs, became the heartbeat of the journey. Didn't matter the country, didn't matter the language. The bells said one thing: we're still here. You'd hear them before you saw them. A shimmer in the dark, a whisper before the silhouette. Sometimes you'd wake up to that sound and, for half a second, forget you were in the middle of nowhere and just feel okay. They didn't ring like alarms. They rang like breath. Inhale, step, chime. Exhale, step, chime. A rhythm older than maps, older than trade. Almost, despite everything, comforting. And then there was the firelight. Not a grand bonfire of destiny, just a flicker. Enough to boil questionable tea and prevent total finger frostbite. Enough to cast weird shapes on tent walls where stories danced. Not published, not footnoted, just improvised folklore passed around like trail mix. One guy's reciting poetry he swears he memorized, but definitely butchered. Another's retelling the epic storm of '87. Swallowed 2 wagons, 3 egos, and at least 1 unlucky goat. Someone claims they saw a ghost. Someone else offers you dried dates and the kind of silence only trauma can teach. And above all that, of course, the stars. Silent, spectating, judging. The original influences, just hovering up there, unimpressed. Some swore they were guides. Others, gods. Some said they were just cold lights in a vast cosmic mare. But when the bells chimed and your breath fogged up like a bad window, you couldn't help but feel seen. If not by the stars, then maybe by the wind doing its best impression of a therapist. And that's when it hits you. This wasn't just about trade. It was about rhythm. About silence that meant something. About not being the main character, but still being part of the plot. You were part of something. Not glorious. Not noble. But real. A human relay race, passing stories and spices like slightly confused but committed baton carriers. And maybe that's why the bells mattered. Not for the camels. They already knew what time it was. For you. To remind you that movement didn't mean panic. It meant direction. You weren't lost. You were just migrating. So next time you hear a faint chime, maybe a spoon in a mug, a subway door closing, or your own sigh echoing off the ceiling at 3 a.m., pause. There's a caravan in there somewhere. Still walking. Still whispering. Still hoping someone remembered to pack snacks. But let's be honest. The merchants of the Silk Road weren't saints. Let's retire that fantasy right now. They weren't out there spreading enlightenment and cross-cultural hugs. They wanted loot. Rare gems. Fancy fabrics. Exotic doodads to sell at a markup and then humble brag about at dinner parties. And yet, they accidentally connected the world. Because capitalism, when left unattended, sometimes builds empires, and sometimes builds empathy. Usually by mistake. They came from everywhere. Some in robes, some in rags. All of them wearing ambition like armor, and blisters like jewelry. Most didn't speak each other's language, but luckily gold is multilingual. Some were born into trade. Others ran away from pasts that involved too many debts and too few options. What united them wasn't nationality or faith. It was motion. And the occasional questionable stew. Did they lie? Constantly. About prices. About maps. about how many lovers they didn't have in Samarkand. But they also listened, adapted, learned. Because curiosity wasn't a bonus, it was a survival skill. They got good at gestures, good at pretending, at nodding in just the right way to avoid starting a war, or at least delay it until after dessert. And sometimes, in all that noise, they fell silent. At a city lit by paper lanterns, at a dome carved like lace, at the sight of someone brewing tea like it was an ancient ritual, and not just something to keep your camel smell tolerable. Because even the most cynical merchant, halfway through their third bad deal of the week, would stop and just marvel at the sheer strangeness of being alive, here, now, in a place your hometown still thinks is fictional. Yes, they were greedy, but also brave, and weirdly poetic, and, on occasion, generous in ways that made no sense on a spreadsheet. They carried more than cargo. They carried gossip, advice, spells, the recipe for something half-remembered and twice spiced. They were basically traveling Wikipedia pages, if Wikipedia had camel breath and a gambling problem. Their pockets? Full of tiny empires. A Roman coin, a Persian poem, a ring that still smelled like someone else's perfume and questionable choices. You could admire them. You could roll your eyes at them. But you couldn't pretend they weren't important. They were the bloodstream of the Silk Road, dragging the world forward, one bargain at a time, one suspicious stew closer to something called progress. So the next time you're scrolling through an online shop filled with handmade earrings from a village you can't pronounce, remember, commerce has always been messy and strange, and somehow the best accidental icebreaker humanity ever invented. Because not everything was for sale. Some things were passed hand to hand, not for profit, but because someone cared. A smile, a pinch of spice, a story with no punchline, a lullaby in the wrong language that still somehow worked. In the end, the Silk Road didn't just move silk. It moved selves. One day, you're from Damascus. Next, you're drinking fermented mare's milk, quoting proverbs you barely understand, and wondering how you ended up playing chess with a man who wears 12 hats. And it works. Because cultures didn't just collide. They bled into each other. A noodle became pasta. A beat became a ballad. A prayer changed accents and kept going. There were no copyright claims. Just tired people around a fire saying, "Wait, how do you do that?" Clothes changed. Food evolved. Even the gods got a makeover, suddenly multilingual, with a flair for cross-cultural fashion. Buddha in Greek robes? Sure. Christian crosses with Persian flair? Why not? Mosques tiled like someone raided a Chinese palace clearance sale? Absolutely. The result? A full-blown fusion buffet of faith. And language? Oh, language threw a party and didn't even try to clean up after. Sanskrit slipped into Persian's DMs. Arabic borrowed a few vowels and never gave them back. Next thing you know, your native tongue has a mysterious accent and 3 new syllables you can't explain. And honestly, don't want to. Because every borrowed word is a passport stamp, a gossip trail, a souvenir from a conversation that never needed permission. Even the insults traveled. Even the jokes. A guy could fall off a camel in India, and someone in Turkey would still get the punchline. That's how far the laughter wandered. No customs, no surveys, just beautiful, chaotic cultural shoplifting. Sometimes uneven, sometimes unfair, always unstoppable. Because humans are contagious, emotionally, linguistically, spiritually. And while spices were valuable, and silk was soft, the real exports were less packable. Ways of greeting, ways of cooking, ways of saying I love you and I hate you with equal dramatic flair. The Silk Road didn't just sell. It softened. It blurred the line between foreign and familiar, until no one could remember where anything came from. And no one cared. So next time you eat Korean tacos, hum a French song with a terrible accent, or wear Indonesian batik to a concert in Berlin. Thank a caravan. They didn't mean to change the world. They just didn't know how to stay still. And maybe that's the most subversive trade deal in history. Not gold, not silk, but self for self. Humanity for more humanity. By this point, let's be honest, the Silk Road wasn't a road. It was an organism, pulsing, drifting, doing its thing while emperors tried, and failed, to control it. It didn't care about borders. It smeared them like eyeliner after a sandstorm. Sure, goods moved, diseases moved, gossip sprinted, but what really started flying was thought. And the world, poor, unsuspecting world, started to feel small. Not Zoom call small. Camel burping, tent snoring, spicer soup small. This wasn't globalization with logos and logistics. It was the analog version. No barcode, just barter. No Wi-Fi, just wind and prayer. Imagine standing in a market in Kasha. Chinese scrolls, Persian perfume, Roman glass, Indian spices, Turkish soap, Mongol fur, Greek amulets, and a melon. Because someone, somewhere, decided this all made sense. It was glorious and deeply unsanitary, but it worked. And for the first time, people realized, wait, your weird local drought raised my lentil prices. Yes, welcome to interdependence. The whole thing was fragile and brilliant and way older than we like to admit. Globalization didn't start in a boardroom. It started in a dusty courtyard full of yelling, haggling, goat smells, and overboiled tea. The exotic became normal. Normal got accessorized. And suddenly your local identity was wearing eyeliner from Persia, earrings from Byzantium, and an existential crisis from India. A woman in Bukhara might be wearing lipstick made of crushed Indian petals, reading poetry in 3 alphabets, and smelling faintly of 4 empires. And no one blinked. Because on the Silk Road, the question wasn't, is this yours or mine? It was, is it fabulous? Does it work? Can we share it without stabbing each other today? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes, less poetic. But the attempt? That was new. That effort to connect was revolutionary. Because once people feel connected, really connected, it's hard to unconnect them. Even after the kings fall. Even after the roads crack. Even after the maps lie to your face. Because if you've ever eaten bread made from foreign wheat, or listened to a stranger's song and felt something shift in your chest, then you felt what they felt. The Silk Road wasn't a route. It was a rumor, one that turned out to be true. Everything is connected. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. And now the hard part. Every great road has a toll. The Silk Road? Oh, it charged plenty. It wasn't paved with gold. It was paved with ghosts. People didn't just trade, they disappeared. Into sandstorms. Into ambushes. Into really bad decisions involving unfamiliar mushrooms. Some vanished mid-journey. Others made it to the next campfire and never got back up. No tombstone. No farewell. Just silence. The road's preferred obituary. Bandits? Abundant. They didn't care if you were carrying silk or just emotional baggage. If it glittered, it got taken. If you resisted, so did you. And even if no one robbed you, nature might. A broken wheel. A stubborn camel. A desert tantrum. Gone. And then, there were the plagues. Yes, those plagues. The Black Death? It didn't come from nowhere. It hitched a ride. Like everything else. Fleas in your cloak. Rats in your cargo. Death, now arriving on camelback. The same road that brought poetry brought pestilence. Because connection, as it turns out, is a two-way street. And sometimes it brings typhus. Villages emptied. Cultures buckled. No time to mourn. The caravan had a schedule. Even without pandemics, the cost was high. Blisters that turned into scars. Loneliness that seeped into your bones. Languages that half-translated into disaster. For some, the Silk Road gave life. For others, it took it and never said sorry. Because this wasn't a fairy tale. It was logistics with delusions of grandeur. You gambled everything, on spice, on survival, on the hope that the next city wasn't worse. And when it failed, no headlines, no statues, just nothing. And maybe that's why it feels holy. Because it's haunted, not by monsters, but by the sheer effort, the exhaustion, the unrecorded sacrifices, the countless names lost not to war, but to wind. So next time you run your finger across a map and trace the elegant curve of the Silk Road, don't mistake it for a path. It's a ledger of everything we've ever been willing to risk, just to feel less alone. They weren't supposed to exist. And yet, there they were. Oasis cities. Like mirages that got bored of being imaginary and decided to show up. Too beautiful to be practical. Too delicate to last. Palm trees whispering in a dozen dialects. Walls made of mud, dreams, and a bit too much optimism. Water shimmering in wells like a reward you probably didn't deserve. You'd wander through hell, sunburned, delirious, unsure if your feet were still attached, and then suddenly, green, shade, something baking. Oh good, you're not dying. You're just arriving. Places like Merv, Samarkand, Dunhuang, Palmyra, not just pit stops. Architectural hallucinations held together by collective delusion and desperate trade. Merchants smelled like 10 countries and poor decisions. Monks floated through like quiet spreadsheets. Children spoke 3 alphabets and still ignored their parents. Every corner was an international crisis disguised as a recipe. Rome flirted with Persia. China borrowed Turkey's wine. India sold spices next to Mongol war memorabilia. Markets buzzed like gossip. Temples built from leftover empires. Libraries hoarded scrolls no one could read. But you never know, right? And then, poof. No flames. No battles. Just the slow, crushing silence of being left out of the next big trend. Trade routes shifted. Wells dried. And the cities, exhausted, bowed out quietly. Some turned to sand. Some became rumors. Some are now tourist traps for people with SPF 50 and unresolved wanderlust. But here's the thing. You can't photograph a heartbeat. And that's what these cities were. The pulse of the Silk Road. A place to stop running and just exist. And maybe that's the real loss. Not that they vanished, but that we forgot how to build places like them. Places that don't just function. They pause you, make you sip, sit, listen, and remember that you're not just surviving. You're participating. So if you ever stumble upon one of those rare places that feels too alive to be efficient, linger, ignore your schedule, order the second tea. Because even if it disappears tomorrow, you were there. And cities like that, they survive in memory, not in stone. And if you stand very still, you might hear something. Not camels, not coins, not monks arguing about soup. Whispers, the kind that refuse to be erased. Voices that once filled dusty alleyways, checkpoint lines, temple steps. Now scattered, like sand with opinions. They whisper about the things no textbook bothers with. A trader who never made it, but whose bracelet ended up starring in someone else's legend. A woman who tried on 3 religions and kept the one that fit. A boy who left with pepper and came back quoting poetry. Cities that lived fast and ghosted the world. Languages that didn't translate, so they just hugged. And people who touched once, then kept walking. They say the Silk Road is gone. Sure. And your grandmother's gossip wasn't important, either. The road didn't die, it just got Wi-Fi. It put on a blazer, moved into airports, fiber optics, server farms. Now it lives in delayed flights and online carts full of weird spices. But the whispers? Those stayed analog. They live in your kitchen drawer. In the song stuck in your head that you don't remember learning. In the way you raise your eyebrow when you negotiate fruit. They're inside you. In how you greet, in how you cook, in how you forgive people who put raisins in rice. Because every whisper that crossed the Silk Road crossed into us. And that's what stayed. Not the gold. Not the route. Not even the maps, which were mostly wrong anyway. What stayed was the memory. That once, across deserts and egos and language barriers, we actually tried to meet each other halfway. So next time the wind brushes your face, don't just check the weather. Listen, there's still a story in there, pretending to be dust. And it's still walking. But not all roads were made to connect. Some were built to divide. And while traders once traced the spine of empires across golden deserts, exchanging silk, spices, and sins, far away, someone else was stacking stone. Not to welcome, to warn. So let's keep walking. But now the sand gives way to frost-bitten dirt. The bells are gone. The laughter, too. Only wind remains, and walls. You feel it before you see it. The shift in the air. The weight pressing in. No scent of incense. No whispers of gods. Just silence, stretched tight across the landscape like a drumskin. And then it appears, not with grandeur, but with gravity. A line on the earth so impossibly long, it could be mistaken for the edge of the world. A wall that didn't just stop people. It swallowed them. Let's begin there. With the fear that didn't build bridges, it built stone. Mile after mile. Dynasty after dynasty. Not to connect. To contain. Let's begin with an empire that had everything. Vast lands, a sharp army, ancient philosophy, hot tea, and a crippling case of anxiety. Ancient China was a blend of wisdom and architectural overcompensation. Because when therapy isn't available, you build a wall. Fear, it turns out, is a fantastic architect. It doesn't build bridges, of course. It builds walls. Tall ones. Long ones. Ones that whisper keep out louder than any diplomacy ever could. And so, the Great Wall of China wasn't born out of a dream of unity. It was carved from panic. That panic came in waves, riding horses from the north. Nomads. Outsiders. People who didn't follow Confucian etiquette or RSVP to imperial banquets. The solution? Stack a mountain's worth of stone and call it security. Because nothing says please leave like a megastructure you can see from space. But this wasn't a weekend project. It took centuries, generation after generation staring into the horizon and saying, what if we just kept going? And before you scoff at the scale, remember, we still build electric fences out of fear of unfamiliar delivery guys. The difference? Ancient China had more time and less reality TV. The idea was simple. Keep the enemies out. The problem? Fear doesn't have an off switch. So the wall kept growing. Every new emperor came in with the same question. Can we make it longer? And with every new extension came more stones, more sweat, more lives swallowed. All because an empire that already had everything still couldn't sleep at night. The wall wasn't just a structure. It was a statement. A passive-aggressive architectural note that said, we have resources, we have manpower, and we have serious trust issues. Imagine being so powerful that your answer to threats is to raise a stone middle finger across the landscape. A masterpiece of anxiety, a sculpture of collective insecurity. Fear crept through the cracks in government, whispering, "They'll return. They'll breach." It didn't matter if they knew where China was. The possibility was enough. And as the wall rose, something strange happened. It became normal. Just another part of the scenery. Fear embedded in the landscape, like lock screens or breaking news alerts. Ironically, many major invasions that rocked China came from within, or through the cracks, or because, surprise, walls don't fly, and fear doesn't stop at borders. But narratives are stronger than facts. "We are safe now," they said, even if the cost was astronomical, even if the real cracks weren't in the stones, but in the people. There was something almost ritualistic about the building. Each brick, a prayer against chaos, a desperate plea to keep the unpredictable at bay. And once fear becomes architecture, it becomes culture, becomes tradition, becomes unquestioned. You don't challenge it. You just keep building. The emperors changed, the dynasties fell, but the wall kept growing, as if the solution to emptiness was stacking it high enough to cast a shadow. And, of course, the people paid. In taxes, in blood, in entire generations who never saw an unobstructed horizon. The wall became a mirror, not of the enemies outside, but of the ghosts within. Fear, pride, isolation, all neatly stacked, signed with the imperial seal. And so fear, humanity's oldest advisor, earned its greatest monument. Not to courage, but to the absence of it. Proof that when fear speaks loud enough, it builds. But if fear was the architect, labor was the sacrifice. The Great Wall wasn't built with blueprints and fanfare, it was built with backs. With hands calloused from lifting stones that didn't belong to them. With spines that bent not from age, but from orders. Most of the names were never recorded. Just peasants, prisoners, soldiers, the disposable bones of an eternal project. They didn't get songs. They got burial under the same wall they built. And let's not romanticize this. The Great Wall wasn't a noble endeavor. It was a logistical nightmare fueled by desperation and a complete disregard for human life. For every stone placed, a body weakened. For every milestone reached, a soul lost. It's said that the wall is the longest cemetery on earth, and it wears that title quietly, like an accusation buried in mortar. Food was scarce. Shelter, worse. Workers froze in winter and collapsed in summer. Many didn't last long enough to see the sun set behind the structure they died for. There were no days off, no hazard pay, no plaques of gratitude. Just the silence of stone and the echo of orders barked into the wind. And yet the wall grew, not because it was efficient, but because it was declared necessary. That's the dangerous thing about large ideas birthed from small fears. They justify anything. If you questioned it, you were unpatriotic. If you resisted, you were replaceable. There's always another prisoner, another poor farmer, another body to break. The wall may have been built to keep invaders out, but it often felt more like it was keeping people in line, in fear, in silence. Each new layer didn't just add height, it added weight. Psychological, social, generational. You weren't just born under a dynasty, you were born under a wall. This wasn't a marvel. It was a warning etched across the land. A monument not to power, but to paranoia with a budget. And still, the wall endures. Tourists walk its stones with selfie sticks and water bottles, unaware they're stepping on centuries of exhaustion, of ambition, of obedience. Because when a wall becomes old enough, people stop questioning why it was built. They just marvel at the view. But buried in the foundations, beneath the layers of history and dust, are the truths no dynasty wanted you to remember. That greatness can be built on grief. That monuments often hide the suffering that raised them. And that fear, when left unchecked, doesn't just whisper, it commands. So the wall stands. Tall, imposing, impressive, but never innocent. And then there were the ones on the other side. The threats. The wild ones. The people with horses instead of houses, stories instead of records, and a reputation carefully crafted by those who feared them most. Nomads. Raiders. Outsiders. The great villains of every empire's bedtime story. Except, of course, no one ever asked them what they thought about the wall, or about the empire that built it. To the people on the outside, the wall wasn't just a line, it was a judgment. A declaration that they were unworthy of engagement, conversation, trade. Civilization didn't mean silk and tea, it meant obedience. And those who didn't kneel were branded as beasts. But the nomads had their own logic, their own maps, their own rhythms. They didn't need palaces, they had speed. They didn't need scrolls, they had memory. And when they saw the wall, they didn't see security. They saw arrogance. A massive stone ego stretched across the landscape. They were painted as threats not because they attacked, but because they refused to fit the empire's narrative. A people who didn't ask for permission, who didn't need a dynasty to feel legitimate, who didn't care about titles or stone borders. And that kind of freedom, that terrifies bureaucrats. The truth is, most of the so-called barbarians weren't trying to burn China to the ground. They wanted space, sometimes trade, occasionally revenge. But mostly, they just wanted to live without being rewritten, without becoming someone else's footnote. Yet from inside the wall, nuance didn't travel well. Fear made everything loud. It distorted. It reduced. It made the world flat, divided neatly between us and them. And while the empire looked out at the steppes and saw chaos, the nomads looked back and saw something else entirely. A civilization too afraid to leave its own shadow. Because that's the strange thing about walls. They don't just keep people out. They trap the people inside. In a loop. In a lie. In the story they keep telling themselves to sleep at night. So yes, the wall was long. And yes, it was strong. But no wall is strong enough to stop time. Or silence. Or memory. Especially not the kind that rides on horseback with nothing to lose and everything to prove. And still, the wall stood. Not because it worked, but because it made fear feel organized. Because in a world full of motion, it gave the illusion of control, of permanence, of safety with a view. Now picture standing atop that wall, not as a tourist in sneakers, but as a soldier in winter boots too thin for the season. The wind doesn't blow, it slices. Your armor creaks more than it protects, and your hands feel more like ice than skin. You're not guarding a wall. You're becoming part of it. Life on the wall wasn't heroic. It was boredom with a side of hypothermia. Endless hours of staring into nothing, waiting for something that almost never came. And when it did, you probably weren't paid enough to care. The watchtowers weren't just strategic, they were psychological. Isolated cubicles of paranoia where a missed signal could mean demotion, or death, or worse. Attention from a superior officer who hadn't yelled at someone in days. Rations were poor, morale worse. You didn't dream of glory. You dreamed of warmth, of home, of meals that didn't taste like regret. You weren't defending a people. You were upholding an idea, a rumor, a fear given bricks and orders. And yet, you stayed. Because the only thing scarier than watching from the wall was being seen walking away from it. And here's where it gets ironic. The wall that was supposed to keep danger out slowly became a cage for those inside. What began as protection morphed into performance, an endless display of vigilance for an empire obsessed with control. You weren't just guarding the wall. You were being watched on it, evaluated, judged. Every movement mattered. Every pause could be suspicion. To leave your post wasn't just abandonment, it was rebellion. Because once protection becomes mandatory, it stops being safety and starts being surveillance. You didn't patrol because danger was imminent. You patrolled because someone had to, because routine had replaced rationale. The wall no longer needed invaders to justify itself. It had become its own reason, its own audience. An empire looking inward, policing itself, sustaining fear like a sacred fire. Everyone played their role. The builders, the watchers, the silenced. And the wall? It watched back. It was no longer a structure. It was a system, a mindset, a message etched in stone. Stay where you are. Stay small. Stay in line. Because any step beyond might look too much like thinking. Too much like freedom. And that's the tragedy no tourist plaque ever mentions. That sometimes, the fortress you trust to save you, slowly becomes the thing you need saving from. The wall turned soldiers into statues. Men posted atop towers so long they forgot the feeling of walking on grass. Not heroes, not cowards, just extensions of the bricks beneath them. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. Their silence was already doing the job. Seasons changed faster than the orders. Snow turned to mud, turned to dust, turned to more snow. The men stayed still, watching an empty horizon like it owed them an answer. Watching each other, and wondering which one of them would crack first. Laughter was dangerous. Sleep was rationed. Dreams, if you had them, were better kept to yourself. Because the moment you looked too relaxed, someone would remind you that comfort is a liability. And what were they even guarding? A country? A dynasty? A stone ribbon across the mountains that no one remembered how to end? Ask them and they'd say order. But it sounded a lot like obligation. Every once in a while, a shadow on the hill would trigger alarm. Horns, arrows ready, muscles clenched. Then, nothing. Just wind. Just goats. Just more time added to their sentence. They weren't warriors anymore. They were ghosts in training. Shadows that moved with the wall. Not because they believed in it, but because they had nowhere else to go. The older ones stopped talking entirely. The younger ones still made plans. After my post, they'd say. After the wall. But deep down, they knew there was no after. There was only stone. Only orders. Only the slow erosion of identity under watchful silence. The wall didn't just break invaders. It broke the men who defended it. Not with battle, but with boredom. With endless waiting. With meaning diluted into routine. Some went mad. Quietly. Others deserted. Also quietly. Because everything up there happened in silence. Even the collapse. Letters from home rarely made it. And when they did, they were stories from another planet. A place with voices, and smells, and softness. The kind of world that didn't fit inside a watchtower. Romance didn't last long. It faded faster than banners in the wind. You couldn't write love poems with frozen fingers. You couldn't promise forever when your tomorrow depended on weather and whim. But still, they endured. Because what else could they do? To leave was betrayal. To stay was surrender. To question was dangerous. So they just kept walking the same stones, tracing the same path, watching the same nothing. The wall didn't protect them. It consumed them. And by the end, they weren't guards anymore. They were relics, worn smooth by the centuries and buried, not beneath the wall, but within it. It's easy now to admire the wall. It photographs well. It climbs even better. A winding dragon of stone slicing across mountains, appearing in postcards, drone shots, and awkward family vacation selfies. From a distance, it looks like pride, national legacy, civilizational glory. But up close, it reads like overcompensation. Pride is a funny thing. It can build beauty, but it can also build prisons. And the Great Wall? It's both. It's the architectural equivalent of shouting, "Look how strong I am," while silently praying no one asks why you needed to prove it in the first place. The wall wasn't just made of stone. It was made of ego, of the kind of pride that doesn't bend, only breaks. A pride so fragile it needed reinforcement every few miles, just in case someone mistook silence for vulnerability. It wrapped itself around the empire like armor worn too long, becoming part of the skin, even as it restricted movement. Pride does that. It starts as a shield and ends up a straitjacket. No one dared question it. You don't mock the crown jewel, even when it weighs down the head. The wall became a national identity, a monument to endurance, strength, and denial. Every dynasty that touched it added to it. Not out of necessity, but out of obligation. To leave it alone would be to suggest the previous emperor had done enough. And when pride runs the show, enough is never an option. So it kept growing. Like a rumor that no one wanted to debunk. Like a lie repeated so often, it starts to sound like legacy. And eventually, the wall became sacred. Not in the spiritual sense, but in the bureaucratic one. It had paperwork, protocols, committees, entire departments dedicated to its maintenance, its mythology, its invincibility. It was too big to fail, too important to question. And yet, every brick whispered what no one dared say aloud, that pride had become policy. That strength was now for show. And still, the wall cast its shadow, long and dignified, not just over the land, but over the minds of those who lived beneath it. It didn't just shape geography, it shaped belief. Because when you raise something high enough, long enough, and often enough, people forget to ask why. They just salute and build more. That's what pride does when it's dressed in stone. It convinces you that to stop building is to collapse. And so the wall endured. Not because it was useful, but because letting it go would mean admitting it was never needed in the first place. And no empire wants to see its pride crumble, especially when it's built right into the landscape. But here's the twist no one likes to talk about. For all the ceremony, all the fear, all the fortress talk, no one really remembers what the wall kept out. Mongols? Bandits? Harsh winds? Take your pick. The invaders came anyway, just smarter and later. Maybe not through the wall, but around it, under it, above it. Because fear is terrible at geography. But you know what the wall definitely kept in? The people. The paranoia. The belief that danger was always one breath away. It taught generations to look outward with suspicion and inward with submission. To guard borders not just of land, but of thought. It created an inside and an outside. An us and a them. And then it made sure the us stayed scared enough to stay inside. The wall filtered movement, conversation, ambition. It fossilized control. Not just over land, but over imagination. What kind of empire builds a wall so long it forgets how to look beyond it? Inside the wall was the known, the manageable, the properly taxed, the silent. Outside, the myth of chaos, even if it was just another village, another trader, another human being with different spices and fewer permits. And that's the cruel genius of it all. The wall didn't need to keep everyone out. It just needed to make you believe it had to. So the people obeyed, and bowed, and built more. Not because the enemy was always there, but because the idea of the enemy never left. The wall turned fear into architecture. It turned rumor into mortar. It turned isolation into national policy. And in doing so, it didn't just defend a nation, it redefined it. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't what's beyond the wall. It's what you bury beneath it. And what was buried? Hope, curiosity, the courage to cross. All sealed behind brick and tradition and stories told too often to question. So next time you see the wall stretching across a mountain like a scar on the earth, don't ask what it stopped. Ask what it silenced. Ask what it cost to keep building. And then ask yourself if it was ever worth it. But nothing, not even walls dressed as dragons, lives forever. Time, that soft-spoken revolutionary, has a habit of undoing even the loudest monuments. It doesn't need armies. Just weather. Just wind. Just silence applied consistently for a few centuries. Bricks loosen. Stones fall. What was once polished is now patched. What once glared in defiance now merely squints against erosion. And no decree, no emperor's signature, no scroll-stamped pride can outvote gravity and rain. It starts small. A crack here, a vine there, a child selling bottled water on the same stones where soldiers once froze. And the empire? It doesn't notice. Because walls don't scream when they collapse. They whisper. They exhale. The wall didn't fall in battle. That would have been dramatic, noble. No, it sagged into history. It rusted. Not in steel, but in relevance. It became scenic, then symbolic, then finally decorative. Something to pose in front of. Something to edit into a travel vlog. Empires have a strange afterlife. They haunt more than they rule. And this wall? It became the perfect ghost. Stoic, impressive, vaguely sad. A postcard with unresolved trauma. And yet, we still marvel. Because humans are sentimental about ruins. We mistake endurance for wisdom, decay for dignity. We build legends on leftovers and call the collapse a design choice. Now tourists walk its length like they're tracing the veins of ancient power. But what they're really stepping over is exhaustion. All those lives, stacked, spent, forgotten, paved into a story no one quite remembers how to finish. Some call it a wonder of the world. Maybe, but wonders usually lift. This one pressed down. On backs. On thought. On the possibility of openness. And in its quiet crumbling, it teaches a louder lesson than it ever did in stone. Because time doesn't rage. It wears. It waits. And in the end, it wins. Not with weapons, but with the absence of them. With the simple passage of days that peel pride like old paint. The wall may still stand in pieces, but the idea behind it, that already fell. The belief that you can trap history. That you can scare chaos away with masonry. That's the real ruin. And now, what remains isn't defense. It's display. A ribbon of rock posing for photos, waiting to be captioned. Strength. Resilience. Maybe even legacy. But never mistake. Because who writes that under a selfie? But here's a thought. Maybe walls don't teach strength. Maybe they teach fear. Fear of change. Of others. Of vulnerability. And when they fall, or fade, maybe that's not loss. Maybe that's clarity. So the next time someone says a wall is the answer, remember this one. How much it cost. How little it kept. And how even stone, eventually, gets tired. History is full of things built to last forever. None of them did. And that's not failure. That's freedom finally getting through. History is full of things built to last forever. None of them did. And that's not failure. That's freedom finally getting through. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Really. In a world built for skipping, You stayed. And that means more than you know. Take a breath. Let it land. Let the dust settle. And when you're ready, I'll meet you in the next story. See you in the next video.